The New Testament in Muslim Eyes. Paul's letter to the Galatians. Written by Shabbir Akhtar, published by Routledge Press 2018. Dr. Akhtar is a research fellow at the Center for Muslim Christian Studies and a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religions at the University of Oxford. He received his doctoral degree in comparative religions from the University of Cambridge. Both universities are in the United Kingdom. I first encountered Dr. Akhtar's works back some 20 years ago while doing research on Islam. In his book entitled A Faith for All Seasons, Islam and the Challenge of the Modern World. In it, he attempts to find a way for Muslims to deal with the conflicts that occur moving from an Islamic society into one that was non-Islamic in its formation and in fact used, for the most part, the Christian religion as the basis for the development of its values. One of the things that, I should say, one of the commonalities that I felt we shared in this book, and that was made even clearer in his new book on the letters to the Galatians, his commentary on the letter to the Galatians, is a commonality of epistemological perspectives. We are both very critical of the postmodern skepticism that seems to pervade so much of Western academia today. As far as I'm concerned, if you push it to its extreme, you will find that it is a self-defeating position. So on that ground, as I said, we're very much in agreement. We're also, it seems, on pretty much the same page with respect to the priority that faith has with respect to works and rules and laws, the following of, however one wants to call it, Torah or Sharia, etc. That without faith in what someone is doing, that the works would be empty. And this is not necessarily the position that St. Paul takes, although it's one that he would have to allow as a possibility, but not where he is really placing his emphasis. In this book, Dr. Akhtar focuses on Galatians, which is about 6 to 7 pages long. At least that is the shortest version that I found in the numerous New Testaments that I have here in the Jewish New Testament, where there are very few footnotes, very few commentaries. So it's, relatively speaking, a short epistle. Dr. Akhtar's commentary on it is 269 pages of text. So there's quite an extensive commentary, as well as reference to other of Paul's writings and to the other apostles, specifically James and Peter. Goes even further into the Gospels and into the Tanakh. Here he makes comparisons and contrasts with the Quran and Islamic beliefs and practices. So it's rather thoroughgoing and extensive an analysis, and one which persons involved in Christian-Islamic relations should take quite seriously. Dr. Akhtar notes that no Muslim has ever translated the Hebrew Bible or any gospel or epistle from its original language. Only Arab Christians have done so. No Muslim has published a translation of any Pauline epistle, let alone a commentary on it. And knowing the degree of Dr. Akhtar's scholarship, I'm sure that he did a thorough review to make sure of the truth of that claim. Now, if we look at the different positions with respect to the relation that Paul has, or that Paul makes, between belief in Jesus and the obligations of the law, the requirements of fulfilling the Torah, we find that the way that it is understood by Jewish scholars, especially as exemplified in this work, the Jewish annotated New Testament. I'm not sure whether one can see the title of it, but that is the title, the Jewish annotated New Testament. We find the following overall interpretation of Paul's position on the law, and it goes as follows. Paul's negative assessment of the Torah and those who follow it is striking. He insists that Torah does not come from God. Chapter 3, verses 19 through 20, no longer has a salvific role, and perhaps never did. Chapter 3, verses 21 through 22, and its observance akin to the worship of Greek gods. Chapter 4, verses 9 through 10. That is, that its observance is akin to idolatry. Well, I looked up these references and concluded that the judgments made by the Jewish scholars is extreme and not justified by what is actually written in those verses. As well, I would reject the interpretation given in that book of chapter 5, verse 2, holding that for Paul, faith not only does not supplement Torah, does not just supplement Torah, but replaces it. The verse reads, I tell you that if you allow yourselves to be circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. That doesn't necessarily mean that he wishes to get rid of all Torah laws completely, but rather that there was a priority operating here. Is it Christ first and then the law, or the law and then Christ? Paul's list of priorities is pretty clear as to which one he places first and which one he looks at secondly. Dr. Akhtar sees Galatians, the reason why he picked Galatians as his main focus of commentary, is that for him it is the Magna Carta of Christian liberty, the very constitution of Christianity. It offers freedom from the law, and it was this issue that he contended with not only among persons who rejected Jesus as Messiah, but even some of them who had accepted him, who came out of the Jewish tradition and who wanted to bring more into the new dispensation, the new religious dispensation, than Paul himself felt was warranted or justified. For them, new converts to this religious movement called the Way had to be preceded by a conversion into Judaism. They needed to be circumcised and follow through on all of what followed from being circumcised. And I think that Dr. Akhtar is correct that there were probably some apostles especially St. James, who were very sympathetic to that view. After all, this is something they had all gone through. Therefore, why should not new believers in Jesus that came from the Gentile world have to do likewise? These people came to be known as Judaizers. And the problem with Paul and the Galatians in this matter is that earlier he had converted or established a Christian community, actually two Christian communities in Galatia. And one of the problems with this letter is to which of those two was this epistle addressed? Something hangs here on the exact time when it was written, depending upon which of the two Galatian groups it was written to. But that's a secondary matter. That is not the real issue that is being dealt with here and that Dr. Akhtar is focusing on. Rather, it is the relation, the tension that exists between belief in Jesus on one hand and one's obligations to the law, to Torah, on the other. Now, the view expressed earlier, the judgments which were reached by Jewish scholars that Paul wanted to completely eliminate the law is not one with which Dr. Akhtar agrees. He notes of that this is not his position, initial or considered. He says that we find new instances and subtleties galore in the totality of his overlook. If we restrict ourselves to Galatians alone, that charge may seem plausible. That is, that he wanted to get rid of the law. However, that is not going to be the case if we look at the entirety of everything that he writes about the law. Here again, we get to an epistemological problem. At least in the tradition that I accept, words, and a word such as Torah, is a token or a symbol for a concept in the mind. The concept is far more complicated than just simply the simple word itself. There are many factors or aspects or characteristics or properties that are involved in the totality of that concept. And if we look at the concept, it's supposed to be directed towards something outside of itself, something in the world or some other dimension other than the interior of the human mind. Out there, it is even grander and greater and more extensive than the human mind's ability to incorporate it into itself as something which it possesses of a truth about what exists outside of the mind. That truth is always greater. So whenever Paul uses this word Torah, we have to try to figure out from context whether he's talking about it in its entirety or whether his focus is only on certain parts of it, certain subsections of Torah. If we bring it up on the internet, and it's easily available, you can see all 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, along with general headings for the groupings into which these rules and regulations fall. So the question always has to be, whenever Paul is using that word, exactly in what sense is he using it? Is it the law, totally and completely, or is it some aspect or some focus or some practice of the law? These are the questions that sort of hang out there, and I think that Dr. Akhtar is correct when he says that Paul was not always as clear as we would like him to be in the modern day, so that we would know exactly, precisely, what it is he is referring to. For sure, Dr. Akhtar is of a mind that there was no suggestion in Paul where he was keen to promote, as he puts it, immorality in general. Um, there was no antinomianism working in Paul. That is, a view that now we can totally and completely dispense with all laws, with all rules, with all obligations, other than a simple act of faith in Jesus as Savior. That's not the position that Paul was taking, and I don't see how anyone that reads into Paul, even in Galatians alone, can come up with that conclusion. Furthermore, we have to put what Paul says here in the greater context of what Jesus himself says about the law, where in Matthew 5:17 he notes that he has not come to abolish but to fulfill the law. On the other hand, he also makes a distinction between the laws of God, those that are proper to revelation itself, and those that were later added by men. He excoriates some of the Pharisees for making more of these man-made laws than the laws which God himself has made. So this is a tension that also is operative in the view that Paul has of the law. Now, in the Jewish tradition, there are two laws that we have to consider. The first of these is the Noahide laws. These are laws that applied to all humanity, whether they knew it or not. The Torah laws applied only to the Israelites, to the descendants of Abraham through Moses. They were not obligatory to people that were outside of that religious tradition. However, the Noahide laws were, and these were 7 in number. If we look at them, we find that they run parallel in many ways to some of the laws in Torah. What are these 7 Noahide laws? Well, first of all, there are prohibitions against worshiping idols. The first of the commandments, along with other laws in Torah that forbid the various ways in which idols can be worshipped. Cursing God, that was forbidden. Murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, and courts of justice. Things which, if you did them, would be destructive of good social order, or if you didn't do them, such as have institutions of authority to make laws and regulate them, that again you would have a lawless society, as well as not eating flesh torn from a living animal. Now, look at the Torah laws, and you're going to find that they oftentimes are specifications, a number of different instances where these laws can be violated. So the sexual immorality laws run quite a number, not only against non-marital relations, but incest and rape and things of this sort. The theft laws, just simply one in the Noahide form, have many different manifestations in Torah. So where Jesus is concerned, there are still commandments that have to be followed. He himself says this. If you would be my disciple, you must follow my commandments. If Paul had written something, if in the letters and epistles, there were statements clearly contradicting what Jesus himself had laid out in the way of parameters which his followers had to work within, then the writings of Paul would never have made it into the canon of the New Testament. Now, one of these statements in Galatians that Dr. Akhtar notes is as follows. This is from Paul now. I tell you that if you allow yourselves to be circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. Every man who allows himself to be circumcised must follow the entire law. So we know here that Paul is referring to the law in its entirety, all of the laws. Many of these Paul saw as now being abrogated or in a process of change or slowly disappearing. Among these were all the laws that required people to follow the festivals and the religious rituals in the temple, the kinds of animals which one had to buy or could not offer up as sacrifice given to the priests so that they could emulate them. All of this was in a process of alteration. How far it would go, well, it was still unclear, and that is why I think that Dr. Akhtar is correct when he says that for James and for Peter and for Paul, they probably had different perspectives as to what is it that we should keep and what is it that we should eliminate. If we take James, he was probably the one that would have wanted to keep the most. He was there in Jerusalem. He was head of the Jerusalem proto-Christian community, as Bart Ehrman calls it. And I think this is a way that he has of identifying what was at the time a number of different perspectives or different views that the church leadership had about the manner in which this community would grow and evolve and form itself and create the structures that any community needs in order to be able to function effectively. Christ didn't write out a list of rules and bylaws, a constitution of the church, so to speak. He just set certain people in charge, gave them a number of commandments, a number of prescriptions which they were to follow, and along with the infusion of knowledge when it was needed through the Holy Spirit, make the decisions that were needed at that time and place for the benefit, the protection of, and the perpetuation of that community. For Paul, if you allow yourself to be circumcised, you have to follow the entire law, and that's where you have to now put your emphasis, that's where you have to put your attention, that's where you have to put your efforts. And so you're not going to have as much time as you need for those other things, those other issues and concerns that are more important, to which the new believer should devote themselves. Furthermore, for Paul, Torah had become something that was virtually impossible for most people individually, and as a result for the society as a whole to fulfill in any way close to the ideal. In fact, if you read the Tanakh, especially if you get into the prophets, we find that over and over again there is an attempt on the part of God through prophets of hitting the reset button for societies that have become sinful and perverted. They engage in idolatry, they engage in all kinds of sexual immorality, they don't take care of widows and orphans, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. And this is why then God sort of leaves them to their own devices, and the eventually the eventual disintegration of that society, and even in some other cases, they're being overrun by a Gentile community and taken into slavery. Christianity tends to emphasize principles, as exemplified in the Beatitudes, over laws as exemplified in the Torah. The Torah tends to focus on specific do's and don'ts. Christianity more on what one should become, what kind of attitudes should develop internally, out of which one acts. And in so doing, many of the proscriptions of Torah will in fact be fulfilled from this kind of motive, rather than one where one looks at a law outside oneself and tries to follow it and spends time checking off those instances where one has succeeded and worrying about those instances where one has failed. In short, it relates, I think, to the tension, to the comparison made between stony hearts that God accuses the Israelites of having with the living hearts which he professes that he will establish in them at some time later in history. Now, one of the comparisons that Dr. Akhtar makes, of which there are a number of them in his book, I'm only going to focus on one, maybe two of them, in comparing the Christian experience with the Islamic one, has to do with the perspicuity of scriptures. He notes that, for instance, James criticizes Paul by saying that some of the things that he has written are difficult to understand, a point I think that's reiterated by Peter as well. And that's understandable, because after all, Paul was far better educated than these other gentlemen were, and he writes far more extensively than they do, and he's treating questions that are seemingly more intractable at the time than they were dealing with. And while we can lament the fact that individually or as a whole, they never gave us all the information that we need decades later or centuries later to resolve some of the perplexities which come out of what they did right. Well, they couldn't foresee that kind of thing. And this is, I think, true in any religion where the text is as critical as it is in Judaism or Christianity or Islam. The Christian scriptures are not as clear and complete as we would like them to be. And Dr. Akhtar does hold that the Quran is much more perspicacious than is true of the Christian scriptures. After all, the Quran itself says that it is a book free of doubt and involution. That's Surah 2, verse, or Ayah 2, that it was an authoritative book, could only have been written by Allah, that its verses are distinct, they're immaculate, they are free from all obliquity, they are a collection of explicit laws, they are illuminating, and the list goes on. And I've only gotten here to Surah 28, and there's another much larger batch going all the way to 114. So that's hardly a complete list, but to cite further examples would be repetitious. Um, yeah, if that's true, then one has to ask of Muslim scholars, then why is there so much disagreement among them about what these texts mean? That's always the problem with the written word. Uh, it has to be interpreted. And in order to interpret it, one has to have a frame of reference for so doing. So uh, this is why there were other writings that were needed in Islam, all these hadiths, in order to try to clarify the areas in the Quran which were confusing or problematic for Muslim scholars to deal with. So I don't think that Islam has any more of a benefit. The Islamic works, the Quran, has any more of a benefit as far as perspicuity or clarity is concerned than do the Christian scriptures. I will agree with Dr. Akhtar that Christian theology, in comparison to other religions, is far more complex. And one can understand why. Most of these religions do not have a Trinitarian understanding of the Godhead. They don't have the problem of the incarnation, God becoming human. They don't have an issue such as the redemption or a sacramental system that has to be explained or understood or analyzed in order to deal with questions that come not only from critics of Christianity, for heaven's sakes, but that Christians themselves have about what it is they are obligated to believe and how they are obligated to act. Dr. Akhtar offers a number of challenges to his Christian counterparts. Let me repeat that. Dr. Akhtar offers a number of challenges to his Christian counterparts. For instance, he writes, in my view, there is a lacuna, there's a gap or a hole in Christian soteriology, which is the theology of salvation, for those of you that are not familiar with theological terms. Anyway, he says that there is a gap or lacuna here. To whom is the price of redemption paid? If paid by God to God himself in a different personal form or an incarnation of himself, it makes him a narcissistic and avenging deity rather than the alleged loving and generous God of the Christian faith. He further goes on to note, it could not have been paid to the devil, since that would make him God's moral equal opponent. And are such questions inappropriate, rooted in the mischief of outsiders and polemicists? Some Christians would concede that the inquiry here is legitimate, one though many would no doubt appeal, eventually, to an escape clause, an exit in mysterium, once all rational explanations and accessible human moral reasonings have been exhausted. Well, I think that, first of all, it is a legitimate question to ask. I think it's above my own theological pay grade at the moment. I would have to look up the sources on this, and I'm sure that it has been dealt with by Christian theologians somewhere along the line. As to the fact that ultimately, if we push it far enough, there may not be an answer which the human mind can come up with, and we have to finally subscribe to or opt for the exit in mysterium. I would ask, is it only Christianity with its doctrines and theology that sometimes has to make use of such a ploy, such a an explanation or lack thereof? Are there not some intractable questions out of Islam that also end up in a mystery, but the human mind cannot grasp or wrap itself around? In closing, I'd like to go back to another commonality of Dr. Akhtar and myself, and that is the tenuous position that any person of faith finds themselves in, especially a faith that is prophetic and which holds promises for the future. For instance, Dr. Akhtar writes, "It would be interesting if the Quran, for all its total confidence about its own alleged truth," and that is a section in parentheses which is included by Dr. Akhtar in his text. I did not include that. For its total confidence about its own alleged truth, which cannot be tested decisively in wholly empirical terms, finally turns out to be false. How would the innocent Muslim cope with such a post-mortem trauma? No doubt some Jews and Christians would then happily shout with satisfaction, or perhaps weep, "Oh, foolish Muslims, we told you so." Now, there are several instances in the book where Dr. Akhtar notes the, as I said, tenuous position of the believer, but I picked this one because it also has an opportunity here for a pastoral reflection. Whoever those on the winning side turn out to be, should they adopt a triumphalist or gloating attitude toward those who had made the wrong choice, I think it would probably put them in an even more perilous position than those that they look down upon. Rather, it should be, at least as far as the Christian position is concerned, rather it should be to see if there are any options open, any avenues that would help ameliorate or bring about a rectification on the part of those who had made the wrong choice, so that they may enjoy the same rewards and benefits as those who had made the right one. The other reason that I brought this up is that this is another one of those indicators of an attitude that Dr. Akhtar and I share. That is that we live in a condition of hope. We know that if and until these events arrive at their termination point, and we achieve what we hope for, we will not know for sure whether that is going to be the case. We hope we're on the right track, but whether we are or not, only time will tell. This means to me that Dr. Akhtar has an underlying devotion, concern for and with the truth, that this is what he is searching for, in spite of the fact that he is promoting Islam in the same way that I do in my commitment to Christianity. So here we are, as I say, pretty much of the same mind. And that is why scholars like Dr. Akhtar, that while they come from different religious perspectives and even possibly different philosophical perspectives, as long as this is what is one of the major motivations of what they are doing, is for me one of the telling and attractive reasons for taking what he says and what he presents in the way of evidence and arguments for a position, even one that I may originally disagree with, or at least taking his argument seriously and analyzing it and seeing how far it goes, how far one can take it. And so I close with a strong recommendation for those interested in comparative religion, and especially those who are interested in Muslim-Christian relationships, interfaith relationships, to buy this book, to read it, and to take the contents in it very seriously. I'd appreciate your leaving a approval or disapproval in the sections on, below. I think I'm getting a little tired. But below, and I'll be very interested in your comments. Thank you. Blessings and peace to you and to those whom you love.